Today's video will follow the true wartime trail of Virginia Hall, the American intelligence officer the Gestapo hunted as the Limping Lady, from her first quiet steps into occupied France to the covert networks she built that helped bend the war's outcome. Virginia Hall is not remembered because she fit the usual image of a spy, but because she shattered it and kept moving when the world expected her to stop. Right now, as her story resurfaces again in modern conversations, articles, and renewed interest in hidden wartime operations, it is worth asking why this one woman still unsettles the easy myths we tell about World War II. Because what is at stake here is not just admiration. It is understanding how a war is truly fought when uniforms mean nothing, and survival depends on silence, timing, and the courage to become invisible. To enter her world, you must step back into the early 1940s, when Europe was under occupation, governments collapsed in weeks, and ordinary streets became places where a wrong word could end a life. Behind the front lines, another war was already underway, carried by secret services and resistance fighters, built from safe houses, coded messages, and the dangerous labor of turning strangers into allies. And in that shadowed war, a single operative with a limp and a wooden prosthesis named Cuthbert would do what entire units could not: connect people, arm them with method, and keep the signal alive while the net tightened around her. So let us begin where the danger starts to feel ordinary, where Lyon is filled with listening ears, where the knock at the door matters, and where Virginia Hall takes her place in a conflict that will not forgive mistakes. I want you to picture a woman moving through a French city that has learned to mistrust its own footsteps. Not because she is clumsy, not because she is careless, because every step she takes has to be measured, chosen, and earned. She walks with a limp, yes, but it is not the limp that matters. It is what the limp dares the world to do about it. In that time, in that place, the smallest habits could get a person killed. A wrong glance at a doorway, a pause too long at a bakery window, a name spoken in a careless tone, the scrape of a chair on a floor, the click of a latch. In occupied France, the air itself felt wired for sound. People learned to speak with their lips barely moving, to say, "Good evening," the way you might say, "I am not the one you are looking for." And yet she moved anyway, through Lyon and its narrow streets, through rail yards and cafes, through apartment stairwells that smelled of boiled potatoes and fear. She moved through the country like a rumor, a foreigner but not a stranger, an American voice behind a French sentence, a journalist's cover story that gave her permission to ask questions that no one should ask. By the time the hunters put a name to the rumor, it was already too late. They called her the Limping Lady. They meant it as an insult. It became a warning. I am telling you this as a man who has spent his life studying quiet wars, the ones that do not announce themselves with banners, the kind fought in basements and train compartments and in the pauses between sentences. The kind fought with forged papers and a steady hand. The kind fought by people who did not look like soldiers, because if they looked like soldiers, they would not survive the first hour. Virginia Hall did not look like the stories people like to tell about spies. She did not look like the posters or the stage plays. She looked like someone you might pass on the street and forget 5 minutes later. That was part of her strength. But her real strength was harder to spot. Even if you were standing right in front of her, it was persistence. She was born in Baltimore in 1906, into a family comfortable enough to believe the world belonged to them and strict enough to demand she prove it. She studied hard, traveled, learned languages, and carried herself like a person who expected to be taken seriously. In her 20s, she aimed for diplomacy, the official kind. The kind with reception rooms and polished shoes, the kind that pretends history is made by paperwork. Then in 1933, in Turkey, history took a different route through her body. A hunting accident shattered her left foot. The injury turned severe. Doctors amputated her lower left leg. In that era, a woman with an amputation was expected to fade into a quieter life, to become a story about misfortune and adjustment. Virginia Hall refused. She gave her wooden prosthesis a name, Cuthbert, and treated it with the strange intimacy of someone who will not be ashamed of what keeps her standing. She reapplied to the U.S. Foreign Service because she still wanted the world. They rejected her. She was a woman and she was an amputee, and those two facts were treated like an argument that could not be answered. So she found another door. She worked her way back into international life through clerical posts and consulates, the kind of work that teaches you how institutions really function. You learn where the authority sits. You learn who actually moves papers, who actually knows what is happening, who actually makes decisions, and who only signs them. Then, war came. When Germany invaded France in 1940, the clean lines of official life broke apart. France fell. Europe became a map of hard borders and soft betrayals. Virginia Hall drove ambulances, moved wounded men, saw what modern war did to bodies and morale. She saw how quickly a nation can be turned into a series of whispered arrangements. And eventually, she reached Britain, where the war had taken on a different shape. The British were building a new kind of weapon, not a tank or a plane, but a network. They were recruiting people who could blend, improvise, disappear, and reappear where the enemy least expected. The organization was called the Special Operations Executive, SOE. Its purpose was not polite. It was sabotage, subversion, and support for resistance. It was a war. Inside the war, Virginia Hall fit the need like a key. Languages, familiarity with Europe, a stubborn refusal to quit, and perhaps most of all, a certain cold practicality. The kind you do not learn from textbooks, but from being told no by the world and continuing anyway. She went into France in 1941 undercover as a reporter for an American newspaper. Think about the elegance of that cover. A journalist is expected to ask questions. A journalist is expected to travel. A journalist is expected to be curious. A journalist can talk to strangers and call it work. A journalist can carry paper and call it notes. She established herself in Lyon, which was both a strategic center and a psychological one. The city sat in a France divided by occupation and collaboration, and it was thick with resistance activity, police informants, and German attention. It was the kind of place where a single wrong contact could lead to a chain of arrests. She began building what the trade called a circuit, not a single group, but a living system. Safe houses, couriers, false papers, money, food, places to hide radios and weapons, people who could move quietly and people who could lie convincingly. She coordinated with individuals who knew the local terrain in ways no outsider ever could. She learned who had the courage, who had the patience, and who had the kind of fear that could be managed instead of denied. You have to understand something about this kind of work. It is not built on heroics. It is built on logistics. A resistance network is only as strong as its weakest routine. A safe house is only safe until it is visited twice by the same person. A courier line is only secure until one courier gets tired, or lonely, or drunk, or falls in love, or talks to the wrong cousin. A radio operator is only alive until the direction-finding equipment triangulates the signal, and then the operator has minutes, not hours. In occupied France, radios were a death sentence written in pencil. You could erase it if you moved fast enough. You could rewrite it if you made the same mistake twice. Virginia Hall coordinated these systems with a temperament that was both cautious and daring. Cautious enough to avoid meetings that smelled wrong. Daring enough to keep moving after others froze. Her work expanded, arranging supply drops, establishing communications, helping Allied airmen who were shot down to escape back to Britain. Each successful escape made her more valuable to the Allies and more interesting to the Germans. Each new contact increased the network's capacity and its exposure. And then came the moment every clandestine operator fears, because it feels like a judgment from the universe. A raid, a meeting compromised, people arrested, names under pressure. The kind of collapse that can roll outward like a fire through dry grass. When a Gestapo raid captured a cluster of agents, Virginia Hall was left in a position both powerful and terrifying. She became, in effect, one of the few remaining operative connectors in her region who could still coordinate and communicate. The network did not die, but it thinned, and in that thinning, every move became riskier. A person who might have been one of 10 now looked like the only one. This is where the legend usually begins. People love the turning point. They love the moment the protagonist becomes the last standing figure. They love to imagine courage as a sudden flame. But courage in this world is less like flame and more like a lamp you keep lit with whatever oil you can find. You keep it lit because if it goes out, you do not get a second chance. Not you. Not the people who trusted you. She helped orchestrate an escape from Mauzac prison in July 1942, a complicated operation involving the kind of planning that would make a military quartermaster sweat. Tools smuggled in, uniforms arranged, vehicles coordinated, timing controlled. People moved out of a secured environment without turning the entire countryside into a net. It was not a single act of bravery. It was 100 small acts of discipline. Now, I want to stop here and do something that most history teachers do not like. I want to ask the question that gets people leaning forward. What if? Because Virginia Hall's story is not only a story of what happened, it is a story that reveals how fragile outcomes were, how close the war was to being shaped by accidents, misunderstandings, and timing. It is a story that shows how much history depends on a handful of people doing their jobs well in the dark. So let me lay out the what-if questions I have turned over in my own mind, the ones I keep returning to because they are not fantasies. They are plausible forks in the road. What if the State Department had accepted Virginia Hall before the war, and she had become a conventional diplomat instead of a clandestine operative? What if her network in Lyon had never been compromised, and she had remained in place through late 1942 and 1943, expanding circuits and escape lines at the very moment German security tightened? What if the Pyrenees crossing failed, and she was captured at the border, where tired bodies and paper-thin cover stories met hard uniforms? What if SOE had redeployed her anyway, despite the risk, betting that her experience outweighed her visibility? And what if the method she refined in France had been adopted earlier and more widely by Allied intelligence, rather than being treated as the unusual craft of an unusually stubborn woman? Each of those questions has a best-case answer. Each also has a shadow answer. And if you understand both, you understand why Virginia Hall's story matters beyond admiration. Let us take the first one. If the Foreign Service had opened its doors to her, Virginia Hall might have spent the war behind official desks, filing reports, attending receptions, translating cables. She would have been competent, perhaps exceptional, but she would have been operating in a world that rewards polish more than improvisation. She would have been a respected official instead of a hunted operative. The best-case scenario, from a national perspective, is that she becomes an unusually sharp, intelligence-minded diplomat early, someone who sees the shape of Europe before others do, someone who warns, advocates, pushes policy. Perhaps she becomes one of those rare figures who shifts a bureaucracy by force of intelligence. But the more likely outcome is simpler. Institutions consume individuals. A gifted person becomes a useful gear. A woman in that era, in that department, especially with a disability, would have fought daily battles just to be taken seriously. Her energy would have gone into proving she belonged rather than into building something new. In other words, if they had accepted her, they might have neutralized her. The rejection that looked like cruelty may have been, in a strange way, an unintentional gift to the war effort. It forced her into the irregular paths where her kind of stubbornness became an asset instead of a nuisance. Now consider the second question, the one that makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. What if her Lyon networks had never been compromised, and she had stayed operational through the tightening winter of 1942 into 1943? You need to remember what happened in that period. German security pressure intensified. The unoccupied zone shrank. The Gestapo's attention sharpened. The risk to radio operators multiplied. Informants multiplied. The very act of traveling became suspicious. A stranger asking questions was no longer merely odd, it was criminal. If Hall had managed to keep her circuits intact, the best-case outcome is not a single dramatic act. It is a cumulative effect. More downed Allied airmen make it out. Each airman saved is a morale victory and a practical one. Trained pilots are not easily replaced. Each escape line that remains functional keeps pressure on German security resources. Every German unit assigned to hunt couriers is a unit not assigned to the front. More sabotage occurs at the right moments. Not random sabotage, but sabotage tied to supply lines and movement. Rail disruptions. Equipment damage, communication interference, the kind that does not win a war alone but can shape the tempo of occupation and the preparation for later Allied operations. More intelligence flows to London. Not romantic intelligence, not the kind that comes in dramatic envelopes, but steady intelligence, troop movements, morale, checkpoints, the rhythms of German logistics. The kind of information that lets planners avoid mistakes. And perhaps most crucially, more trust built. Resistance movements are not only political, they are personal. They depend on people believing that help is real, that contact is safe, that someone is coordinating rather than improvising. Hall was good at coordination. If she had remained in place longer, she might have strengthened a wider web earlier. That is the best case. But the shadow answer is just as plausible. The longer she remained, the more likely it became that her name and face and limp would become a fixed target. Clandestine work is not like conventional combat where you can survive multiple engagements by skill. It is more like gambling with loaded dice. Even the best operator loses eventually if the game lasts long enough. So, in the best-case version of this scenario, Virginia Hall's circuits become a backbone for wider resistance coordination earlier, and the Germans spend more time and resources chasing ghosts. In the shadow version, her continued presence becomes the focal point of a concentrated manhunt, and the network collapses in a more catastrophic fashion later, when it is larger and therefore capable of dragging more people down with it. Now the third question, the Pyrenees. This is not a romantic mountain crossing. It is not a scenic tale. It is cold, exhausting, and humiliating in the way only physical suffering can be humiliating. People imagine a wooden prosthesis as a quirky detail, but on a mountain, it becomes a constant negotiation between bone, wood, snow, and pain. It rubs. It slips. It makes balance uncertain. It turns every step into a calculation. The best-case scenario is the one that happened. She makes it across. But the what-if fork here is brutal because it is so small. A single slip, a delay. A border patrol encountered at the wrong hour. An informant who noticed the limp. A guide who lost his nerve. A footstep heard where it should not have been heard. If Virginia Hall had been captured during that escape, the consequences would have been immediate and layered. First, her networks would have been at risk of exposure. Even the strongest person has limits under interrogation, and even silence can be interpreted as guilt and used as a pretext to arrest everyone around you. Second, German propaganda would have used her capture to send a message, not just to the resistance, but to women, to foreigners, to anyone who believed they could outwit the occupation. Third, there would have been a chilling effect inside SOE and among the resistance circuits. People do not simply lose an operator. They lose confidence in the possibility of surviving. And yet, there is a strange resilience in these systems. Networks adapt. Someone else steps in. A new courier route forms. A new radio operator takes the risk. The human capacity to continue is one of war's most frightening facts. So even in the worst-case capture scenario, the best-case counterpoint is that the resistance still fights, but in a more cautious and fragmented way, which could slow the tempo of sabotage and intelligence in that region at a crucial moment. Now let us take the fourth question, because it reveals something about institutions and fear. What if SOE had redeployed her anyway after her escape, despite the fact that she was compromised? The cautious answer, the one they effectively chose, is that a known operative is a liability. Her appearance and limp were too distinctive, her story was too widely circulated. To send her back would be to gamble with a loaded gun. But there is a best-case version where SOE takes the gamble and wins. Hall returns with deeper knowledge of the security environment and uses new disguises, new cover, new routes. She becomes not only an operator but an instructor, teaching others and expanding competence, and there is a shadow version where she is captured quickly and the gamble fails. Institutions tend to fear that kind of failure more than they value potential success, because failure is visible. Success is silent. No one awards medals for the disaster that did not happen. This is the paradox. The very people best suited for clandestine work often threaten cautious institutions because they make decisions under uncertainty and accept risk as a daily ration. Virginia Hall did not accept being told no as final. That is the through line from the State Department to SOE to the later American services. When one door closed, she found another. When she was told she was too visible, she learned to become invisible in new ways. Now, the fifth question is where the story begins to lean toward the early Cold War, even though we are still in the middle of the Second World War. What if Virginia Hall's methods had been treated as doctrine earlier? Because her operational importance was not simply that she was brave. It was that she understood the architecture of clandestine power. She coordinated circuits like a civil engineer designs bridges. She knew where stress points formed. She knew that people needed money, food, reassurance, and simple instructions that could be followed under pressure. She knew that a safe house is not safe if it becomes familiar. She knew that a network is not secure if it depends on a single personality. These are not glamorous lessons. They are the lessons that win. If those methods had been institutionalized earlier, the best-case scenario is that Allied clandestine efforts become more consistent, less dependent on singular heroes, more capable of surviving setbacks. That could mean stronger resistance coordination earlier, more effective sabotage campaigns tied to strategic objectives, and more survivable radio practices. And again, the shadow answer exists. The more effective the clandestine campaign becomes, the harsher the occupation becomes in response. Repression grows, civilian suffering increases. That is the moral weight of clandestine warfare. You do not throw a stone without accepting that someone else may pay for the ripple. So when you hear Virginia Hall's name, do not reduce it to a legend. Understand it as a study in systems. A woman with a limp building networks that could endure, not because they were invincible, but because they were designed with realism. Now let me return to the story's spine, because speculation only matters if you keep your hands on the facts. In late 1942, the risk around her became intolerable. The Germans and French authorities had a description. Posters circulated. The limp became a signature. She was hunted not only as a spy, but as a symbol of humiliation. An occupied society is dangerous enough. An occupied society with a manhunt in motion is a tightening vice. And so she did what disciplined operators do when the mission's continuation threatens the mission's existence. She left. Before she crossed the mountains, she sent a message that has lived longer than many battles. She mentioned that she hoped Cuthbert would not be bothersome. Headquarters misunderstood, thinking Cuthbert was a person, perhaps an informant, perhaps a liability, and replied with cold bureaucratic absurdity. If he is giving you trouble, have him eliminated. In that moment, the war's machinery revealed itself in miniature. Lives and limbs and misunderstandings compressed into a sentence. It was dark humor, yes. But it was also a reminder that clandestine work is always partly human and partly mechanical, and the seam between the two is where errors happen. She crossed the Pyrenees on foot. Deep snow, narrow passes, pain that does not need poetry, people around her carrying their own fears and fatigue, every step an argument with gravity. Every hour, a gamble that the next ridge would not reveal uniforms. She made it into Spain, and then, in a final indignity, she was arrested for illegal crossing. Even a successful escape can end in a cell. That is how these stories go. They are not neat. They do not reward you immediately. You can outwit a security service and still lose to paperwork. Spanish authorities held her briefly. The world at that time was layered with neutrality, with suspicion, with nations trying to survive by balancing between powers. Eventually, the U.S. Embassy secured her release. And now imagine her at that moment, exhausted, hunted, and free. Not triumphant, not safe, simply alive, with the knowledge that the war was still burning and that she had unfinished work. In London, there were people who would tell her the rational thing. You have done enough. You are compromised. Your name is known. Let others take the risk. Virginia Hall was not built for that kind of ending. She had not crossed mountains to retire into silence. She had not carried a wooden leg through snow to become a footnote. She wanted back in, and when one service judged her too visible, she did what she had always done. She found another door, another set of hands willing to place a weapon in the form of responsibility back into her grip. That is where the next phase begins, not as a fresh chapter, but as the same will in a different uniform, moving again into the same dangerous country, this time with the weight of an invasion approaching and the countryside waiting for signals that would decide who lived and who vanished. What if the war didn't end? It just changed its clothing. That is the question I kept hearing in the corridors of power after 1945, when men congratulated themselves and tried to sweep the shadows back under the rug. They wanted parades and certainty. They wanted the world to behave again. But the world does not behave. It reorganizes. It finds new excuses for the same appetites. And if you want to understand why Virginia Hall matters beyond the glamour people like to paste onto her name, you have to follow her into the years when the gunfire faded and the whispering got louder. Because here is the hard truth. It is one thing to outlast the Gestapo. It is another thing to outlast your own side. You asked what it tells us that a woman who could outwit the most feared security apparatus in occupied France could still be underestimated by her allies. I will tell you what it tells us. It tells us that institutions are often more comfortable with failure that looks familiar than success that looks like it came from the wrong person. In wartime, results are a necessity. In peacetime, results become a threat to hierarchy. Virginia Hall returned from her wartime work carrying something few people carry. Not just memories, not just scars, not just medals. She carried an internal calibration of risk that made ordinary caution look childish. She had lived in a world where a knock at the door could mean the end of everyone in the apartment. She had lived in a world where a radio signal could summon death faster than a police siren. When the war ended, people expected her to celebrate. They expected her to soften. They expected her to turn into a story you could tell at dinner. She did not. She had no appetite for being displayed. The work had not been about applause. It had been about survival and method. And method does not retire neatly. So let us talk about the best-case fork that hangs over this period like a hidden weather front. What if, after the war, the United States had made Virginia Hall a public symbol? Not a classified name passed between offices, but a public figure held up as the face of Allied clandestine victory. A woman on podiums, a living rebuttal to the men who said women could not do the hardest work, a celebrated hero, a national example. The best case is seductive. Think about what that might have done in 1946 and 1947. Think about the girls who would have seen her and decided their lives were not limited by what a department head believed. Think about the bureaucrats who would have had to swallow their doubts in front of cameras. Think about how quickly a public narrative can force institutions to change their language, if not their hearts. But the shadow side is equally strong, and it is the reason the best case did not happen. Publicity is poison to clandestine work. The same society that cheers you today can get you killed tomorrow by repeating your name too loudly. And in the early Cold War, when the new contest began, intelligence services did not want public heroes. They wanted quiet professionals. They wanted deniability. They wanted the public to forget the kinds of things that had been done in the dark. Virginia Hall, of all people, understood that. She did not need a spotlight. She needed a desk, a file, a mission, and permission to do the work. The post-war world offered a new landscape of hidden conflict. Europe was not only rebuilding buildings, it was rebuilding loyalties. Governments were shaky, parties were fighting for control, old resistance groups were splitting into new factions. The lines were no longer simply German and Allied. They were ideological, and they ran through families, churches, unions, and police departments. This is where the story becomes less romantic and more instructive. Because in that environment, the skills Virginia Hall had refined in France were suddenly relevant again, but in a different key, network building. local trust, secure communications, safe houses, courier lines, the discipline of avoiding patterns. The problem was not whether those skills mattered. The problem was whether the new institutions that inherited the wartime apparatus were mature enough to use them wisely. By 1951, Virginia Hall formally joined the Central Intelligence Agency. People hear that and imagine a smooth transition, as if the agency simply welcomed her as a legend and put her in charge of the next chapter. That is not how it works. New agencies are not only made of ideals, they are made of people, and people carry their habits like luggage. The same biases that kept her out of diplomacy did not evaporate just because she had proven herself. In many offices, a woman was still treated as a novelty, an exception, a figure to admire in hindsight and ignore in meetings. So here is the next best-case scenario. What if, in 1951, the CIA had placed Virginia Hall in a position to shape doctrine and training broadly instead of treating her as a specialist to be used and tucked away? The best case is that her wartime lessons become standard, not whispered folklore, not anecdotes repeated at bars, but formal doctrine. How to build networks that do not collapse when one node is taken. How to vet contacts without paralyzing the operation. How to keep communications alive under surveillance pressure. How to teach discipline to people who think discipline is cowardice. How to protect civilians while still achieving operational objectives, or at least how to understand the moral cost when you cannot. If those lessons had been institutionalized early and deeply, the early Cold War might have been less reckless in certain theaters. It might have avoided some of the amateurism that comes when ambitious men believe cleverness is a substitute for patience. But the shadow side is the same old story. Institutions do not like being taught by people who embarrass them, and they especially do not like being taught by women who have done the work better than the men writing the memos. Virginia Hall kept working anyway. The places she worked, the exact assignments, often lived behind closed doors for decades, and that is appropriate. The point is not to name each street an office. The point is to understand the nature of the work. Post-war intelligence in Europe was often about rebuilding networks in a landscape full of broken trust. It was about monitoring political shifts, supporting certain groups, countering others, and trying to predict where the next rupture would occur. It was about learning how to live inside ambiguity, because ambiguity had become the permanent condition. This is where Virginia Hall's temperament mattered again. She did not romanticize resistance. She had seen what happens when people play hero. She understood that courage without concealment is a funeral plan, and she understood something else that is uncomfortable to say aloud. In clandestine war, your allies are not always clean. You may need the help of people whose motives are mixed, whose hands are not perfect, whose loyalties are conditional. A naive service insists on purity and ends up blind. A cynical service assumes everyone is corrupt and ends up paranoid. A mature service learns to evaluate people the way Virginia Hall evaluated them in occupied France, not by speeches, but by behavior under pressure. Now, let me bring you back to the viewer's seat, because you wanted this told not like a textbook, but like a secret chronicle you can follow. Imagine her, in the early 1950s, moving through the bureaucratic quiet of a new agency, surrounded by men who speak in controlled tones and never fully say what they mean. She is older now, but not softened. Her limp is still there, but the limp is not the story. The story is how many people in that building still cannot look at her without trying to shrink her into something easier to manage. Some men admire her as a legend. Legends are safe. Legends cannot ask for resources. Legends cannot argue in meetings. But the living Virginia Hall is not a portrait on a wall. She is a professional with an operating mind. She has opinions about security. She has opinions about tradecraft. She has opinions about what works and what gets people killed. And I promise you, in that era, a woman with opinions could make a room colder than winter. So here is another fork worth considering. What if Virginia Hall had chosen to leave the intelligence world after the war and write her story publicly? The best case is cultural. Her memoir becomes a torch. It exposes the costs of clandestine war without turning it into fantasy. It shows what women can do when they are not boxed in by polite expectations. It forces public recognition of the resistance networks, the safe housekeepers, the couriers, the radio operators who rarely received credit. It might have changed the way a generation understood courage. But the shadow side is operational and personal. A memoir would have risked exposing people who survived. It could have endangered old contacts and their families. And it would have made her a target in a world where targets were no longer only German, but ideological, international, and sometimes indistinguishable from ordinary criminals. Virginia Hall avoided that path. She was not hungry for attention. She was hungry for effectiveness. That choice tells you a great deal about her character and the era. After 1945, many people wanted to package the war into a moral tale with clean heroes and clean villains. Virginia Hall knew better. She had lived too close to the machinery. Now, if you want a viral angle, here is where the most gripping "what if" lives. What if the early Cold War had forced Virginia Hall back into something like occupied France again, not against Germans, but against a different security machine? The best case, for those who like neat outcomes, is that her methods allow the West to build resilient networks behind hostile lines, networks that survive pressure, protect people, and provide reliable intelligence. But the shadow side is that the early Cold War did not reward subtlety the way it should have. It rewarded speed. It rewarded big promises. It rewarded operations that looked decisive on paper. And in that kind of climate, the patient network builder can be ignored in favor of men who promise quick triumph. That is where institutions become dangerous, not because they lack courage, but because they chase results the way gamblers chase losses. Virginia Hall had never been a gambler. She was a builder. In France, she did not win by drama. She won by logistics. She won by refusing predictable habits. She won by making herself small when others wanted to be big. She won by understanding that resistance is not a gesture, it is a system, and systems are hard to sell to ambitious men who prefer slogans. Still, she stayed. She worked. She carried out assignments that demanded discretion. She endured the daily grind of an agency learning what it was, and she did so until 1966, when she retired. Retirement. People say the word like it is a warm blanket. For someone like her, it can feel like exile. Think about what she had been for decades, a person of motion, a person of contingency, a person who lived with the idea that the next knock might matter. To step away from that is not always relief. Sometimes it is emptiness. Yet there is another best-case fork here. What if she had been brought into training roles openly within the agency, shaping young officers face to face? That best case is not flashy, but it is powerful. It means her habits of discipline would have been transmitted like a craft, not like a rumor. It means young officers would have learned to respect local knowledge, to build redundancies, to avoid arrogance, to prioritize the safety of networks, and to accept that the best operations often look boring. In other words, it means the agency might have grown up faster. Whether that happened enough, I cannot say in full detail without stepping into what is still guarded. But I can tell you this. Her example remained. Even when institutions try to minimize the people who make them uncomfortable, they cannot erase the gravity of proven method. Now let me bring the story back to a human scale, because if you only talk about agencies and doctrine, you miss the soul. Virginia Hall avoided publicity even late in life. The people closest to her did not always know the full shape of what she had done. That is not because she was cold. It is because secrecy had become a second skin. When you train yourself for years to hold your tongue for survival, you do not suddenly become chatty because a war ends. She died in 1982, far from the mountain passes and safe houses, far from the radio messages and the hunted nights. And yet, if you listen carefully to the history of clandestine work, you can still hear her influence, not as a slogan, as a habit. So here is the question I want to put directly to you, because it is the one that decides whether this story is entertainment or education. If Virginia Hall's greatest weapon was not a gun but a method, then why do so many people still reduce her to a legend instead of studying her like a blueprint? And here is the follow-up, the one I want you to answer in the comments if you are serious about this era. If you could change one decision in her story to create the best case outcome for the war and the world after it, which would you change and why? Because once you answer that, you are ready for what comes next, when the Cold War begins to harden and the same old human weaknesses, pride, impatience, and fear, begin shaping operations the way they always do. What if the hardest part of Virginia Hall's war was not the manhunt in France, but the quieter battle afterward, when the enemy stopped wearing a uniform you could recognize? That is where I left you. On the edge of the new age, when victory speeches had faded and the world began dividing itself again, not by occupied and free, but by trust and suspicion. The kind of division that creeps into offices, into neighborhoods, into friendships, until people forget what peace is supposed to feel like. I have watched nations celebrate the end of a war as if history can be dismissed with a handshake. It cannot. History only changes its methods. The pressures that drove men to invade and control do not evaporate. They relocate. They learn new manners. They speak in softer voices while they sharpen their tools. Virginia Hall understood this earlier than most, because she had been trained by experience to never confuse the absence of gunfire with safety. She did not come out of France believing in happy endings. She came out believing in contingencies. That is why she kept working. And that is why, when people talk about her as if she belongs only to the years of occupation and escape lines, I always push back. Because if you reduce her to that period alone, you turn her into a legend instead of a lesson. You make her limp into a symbol, and you miss the more dangerous thing she carried. She carried a method that worked. Now, if we are going to finish this story honestly, we must finish it where truth usually hides, in the aftermath, where institutions try to tidy up, where reputations are negotiated, and where a woman who did extraordinary work is expected quietly to become ordinary again. That expectation never fit her. I want you to picture her in the early 1950s, inside the rooms where decisions were made about Europe's future. Not a battlefield, not a safe house, not a mountain crossing. A desk, a memo, a meeting, a man speaking with confidence about risks he has never taken. In such rooms, a person like Virginia Hall can be more threatening than any foreign agent because she carries evidence. She carries a living contradiction to every excuse that kept women out, every comfortable assumption that bravery belongs to a certain kind of body, a certain kind of voice, a certain kind of pedigree. And in that period, people protected their assumptions as fiercely as they protected their borders. So, let me take you into the final set of best-case questions, the ones that tie her whole life together and make her story more than an astonishing wartime tale. What if, after 1945, intelligence services had chosen maturity over ego? What if they had built their future around people like Hall, the builders, rather than the showmen? What if her approach to networks and tradecraft had been treated as foundational doctrine, not a curious wartime improvisation? What if the United States had made her not a public celebrity, but an internal authority, a teacher with real influence, protected from petty politics? And finally, what if Virginia Hall herself had wanted the spotlight and used it, not for applause, but to force a cultural shift? The answers to those questions do not only change her story, they change the shape of the Cold War that followed. Because the Cold War, in its earliest years, was not a single conflict. It was a series of pressure points. Berlin, elections, strikes, intelligence penetrations, propaganda, covert support, counter-support, fear dressed up as policy. And in that world, the most valuable people were not always those who could talk. They were those who could build reliable human systems in unreliable conditions. That was Hall's craft. I have said before that she was underestimated even by those who benefited from her work. That is not speculation. That is the pattern of institutions. In wartime, you use anyone who can produce results. In peacetime, you reward those who resemble the institution's preferred image of itself. Virginia Hall did not resemble it. She did not behave like a courtier. She did not flatter. She did not sell fantasies. She had already survived the consequences of fantasy. She knew what happens when you trust the wrong person. She knew what happens when you repeat a pattern too often. She knew what happens when you place your pride ahead of your security. So when she formally entered the CIA in 1951, she stepped into a young organization carrying old habits. New name, new structure, but human nature does not reset with a reorganization chart. There is a temptation to imagine that her medals would have shielded her from that. They did not. Decorations impress the public. Inside institutions, they can inspire respect and resentment in equal measure. Some looked at her and saw proof of excellence. Others saw inconvenience. Because excellence has a way of raising questions that mediocre people cannot tolerate. Questions like, why did we not do this sooner? Why did we refuse her before? Why did we assume she could not? Why are we still assuming? If you want to understand why she avoided publicity, you can start there. She had no patience for performance. She had learned that performance gets people killed. What did she do in those years? The broad answer is simple. She did what she had always done. She applied method to uncertainty. Post-war Europe was full of fragile governments and shifting loyalties. Networks had to be built, assessed, protected, and sometimes dismantled. Information had to be gathered without setting off alarms. Partnerships had to be formed with people who were not always admirable but were sometimes necessary. It was a world where the line between patriot and opportunist could be thin, and where an intelligence failure could be measured not only in embarrassment, but in lives ruined. This is where her wartime discipline mattered most, because it is one thing to build a resistance circuit against a clear occupier. It is another thing to build and manage clandestine operations in a world where the enemy may not be obvious and the ally may not be reliable. In that environment, arrogance is fatal. Virginia Hall was not arrogant. She was exacting. And this brings me to the best case fork that should haunt any serious student of intelligence. What if, at the start of the CIA era, the agency had been shaped primarily by operators who understood networks the way Hall did? The best case is not glamorous, but it is profound. It means fewer reckless operations built on thin assumptions. It means more respect for local realities, for the fact that a society is not a chessboard and people do not move like pieces. It means more emphasis on verification, redundancy, and patience. It means fewer promises made to leaders who want quick results, and more honest counsel that the world is complicated and cannot be bullied into simplicity. In short, it means an intelligence culture that values truth over theatrics. Now, the shadow answer is also true. Even the best tradecraft cannot purify politics. Intelligence agencies serve governments. Governments have agendas. In the Cold War, agendas were sharp. Sometimes they demanded action, even when action carried moral cost. But I will argue this as a historian and as a storyteller who has spent too many nights thinking about how nations drift into disaster. If more Virginia Hall thinking had been embedded early, the drift could have been slower. And sometimes a slower drift is the difference between correction and catastrophe. Let me speak more personally now, because this story has always felt personal to me in a way that surprises people. Virginia Hall's war was not only against the Germans, it was against the idea that she should shrink. She fought that idea in the State Department. She fought it in SOE's doubts. She fought it in every room where men assumed they knew the limits of a woman's body and mind. And she fought it without speeches, without manifestos, without demanding applause. She fought it by doing the work so well that denial became absurd. That kind of victory does not always produce happiness. It produces quiet satisfaction and a deep exhaustion. By the time she retired in 1966, she had spent decades living inside institutions that needed her more than they understood her. Retirement for someone like that is not a celebration. It is a closing of the door on a life that was always half-lived in secrecy. You might expect her to finally speak freely then, to tell stories, to accept recognition. She did not. Some people read that as coldness. They are wrong. It was discipline hardened into habit, and it was also protection for herself and for others. She had carried secrets that did not belong to her alone, so she lived quietly. And she died in 1982, leaving the world with an odd imbalance, a woman who had influenced the outcome of war and yet remained unfamiliar to many who benefited from that outcome. That is where modern writers and historians come in years later, trying to restore her to view. Some do it well, with respect for the craft. Others do it poorly, turning her into a kind of costume. Here is how you can tell the difference. If the retelling focuses mainly on the limp and the chase, it is selling you a thrill. If the retelling focuses on the network, the discipline, the logistics, the quiet leadership, it is trying to teach you something real. Because Virginia Hall's true story is not that she was hunted. Many were hunted. Her true story is that she built systems that functioned under pressure, and she did it while carrying burdens that would have broken most people. Now, I promised you cohesion, and I will give it to you in one line. Her life forms a single continuous argument that limitations are often imposed by institutions, not by reality, and that method beats spectacle when lives are on the line. That argument begins in Baltimore, with a young woman who refuses to accept the boundaries of her era. It continues in Turkey, with a wound that could have ended her life's ambition and instead becomes part of her identity, named without shame. It rises in France, where she builds circuits in Lyon, where she learns that the smallest repeated habit can be fatal, and where she organizes human beings into something more powerful than fear. It tightens in the Pyrenees, where she proves that stubbornness is not a personality trait, but a survival skill. It expands again with OSS, where she returns to France in a disguise meant to be invisible, and turns scattered resistance into coordinated disruption at the moment it matters. And it continues into the Cold War, where she remains what she always was, a builder of networks, a reader of human behavior, a professional who does not need to be believed by everyone, only by those who matter. Now let me bring you back to the viral question that makes people argue, because argument is where learning begins. If you could change one moment in her story to produce the best case outcome, which would you change? Would you change the State Department's rejection, letting her become a diplomat and possibly shaping policy early but losing her wartime impact? Would you change SOE's decision to keep her from redeployment, risking her capture but perhaps gaining earlier coordination in France? Would you change the timing of supplies and sabotage planning, making resistance more strategically effective at the cost of harsher retaliation? Or would you change the post-war handling of her expertise, embedding her methods into doctrine early, so that the intelligence world that followed became less impulsive and more patient? My answer, if you force me to choose, is the last. Because the war was won by armies, yes, but it was also won by systems. And a post-war world, with its new tensions, needed better systems more than it needed louder heroes. If Virginia Hall's method had been treated as a foundation rather than an exception, then the decades that followed might have contained fewer costly illusions. That is the best case worth considering. And now, as I close this chronicle, I want to leave you with an image that fits the truth of her life. Not a parade, not a speech, not a headline. A late hour, a small lamp, and the sound of keys striking paper in a quiet office. Each line precise, each sentence chosen, each name guarded. A woman who has already walked through danger that would terrify the men around her, now doing the work that prevents new dangers from growing unnoticed. That is Virginia Hall. Not a myth, a method. Now do one thing for me. Tell me in one sentence which, what if you believe would have changed history the most, and why? And if you know someone who thinks courage only looks one way, share this story with them. When I close the last page on a story like this, I do not feel the neat satisfaction people expect from victory. I feel the weight of what it took to earn it, and how little of it could ever be spoken aloud in its own time. Virginia Hall moved through a war that punished visibility. She built strength out of quiet routines, out of the discipline of not being seen, out of the patience to let a plan ripen instead of rushing toward applause. In occupied France, the heroic act was often the one no one noticed, the safe door left unmarked, the courier who did not hesitate, the radio message sent quickly and then silenced, the train line disrupted at the moment it mattered, the prisoner let out under a borrowed name. Those were the events that shaped outcomes, not because they looked grand, but because they changed the odds. And those odds carried forward into the post-war world. When the shooting stopped, the habits of secrecy did not. The same skills that kept resistance alive became the foundation of a new era, one where nations tested each other through shadows instead of trenches. Hall's story reminds us that the post-war world was not built only by conferences and treaties. It was also built by people who understood that power often travels through human networks long before it reaches a map. Her work helped define what intelligence work would become, not as a romantic game, but as a craft with a moral cost. Because secrecy protects, but it also isolates. It keeps operations alive, but it can leave the operator alone with memories no one else is permitted to share. It preserves lives, but it steals recognition from the very people who paid the price. Hall carried that cost in a way that feels almost unbearable to modern ears, not because she was fragile, but because she was exact. She knew that the greatest victories would never be celebrated publicly, and she accepted that bargain anyway. That is what stays with me most tonight. Not the chase, not the posters, not the nickname the enemy gave her. What stays with me is the method. A woman refused by the polite world, then trusted by the dangerous one, then proven right by outcomes that history only slowly admits. A single mind turning fear into logistics, turning scattered courage into a system, turning a hunted life into a quiet kind of leverage. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the room where the record is kept, a lamp burning low, paper shifting, the soft strike of keys as names are set down carefully, as if the very act of writing them is an act of respect. And somewhere beyond that page, the mountains she crossed still stand in winter, indifferent to legend, holding the memory of a person who would not stop. We tell these stories because the world loves drama, yes. But we also tell them because the truth is often hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to assemble it. Virginia Hall's life asks us to look past the obvious and study what actually wins: discipline, adaptability, and the courage to keep going when the world tells you you are finished. So, here is what I want to ask you directly before I step away from this account. If you could change one what if in her story to create the best possible outcome, would you change the moment she was rejected by the official world, the moment she escaped across the mountains, or the moment her hard-earned expertise was quietly folded into the next era without the recognition it deserved? Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated on our uploads. And as the lights dim and the last sentence settles into silence, I find myself thinking the same thought I always do when I finish her story: how many other victories are still walking on unnoticed feet?